This is very exploratory, and I'm concerned about taking you over terrain which you may not be all that familiar with, but I will try and make it as intelligible as possible. I do not have many slides, but I have a clip towards the end which I hope captures something of the expanded sense of what the cinema could be in political terms today, in terms of the imagination of people in power, in terms of logics of mass communication and the constitution of mass politics. That will come towards the end of the presentation. But right now, I just want to briefly map 2 or 3 kind of key issues. One of these is something which Sarkari has been grappling with probably since its inception, which is the question of the fact that you have multiple media forms and levels of technological access and use, and also that there is a category which a colleague of mine has developed, the obfuscation of obsolescence. That things do not disappear, they do not go away, they tend to be reused, redeployed, repaired in a multitude of ways. So there's this sense of a co-presence of technological experience as an ongoing part of the fabric of what media means. That is one key issue for us, I think, over time, and it's only been strengthened in the contemporary in ways which I'll briefly suggest to you. The key here is that we have a kind of online life, but there's the varieties of infrastructural constraint, obviously, make that limited in terms of to whom all it can reach, who all can access it, which does not mean that the life of the net is not connected to diverse populations which may not have direct access to it, but may actually access it indirectly and through a series of ways of transferring material onto portable media. And that relationship between the virtual and the portable and the actual making present of media forms is something which I think is part of a longer history which we are contending with, trying to understand. I'll just briefly refer to something which I haven't unfortunately put up in my PowerPoint, is the work of a colleague whose name I should have spelled out. It is Prathama Banerjee, who is a historian and a social theorist who works at the same center I do, but who has been trying to develop a notion of the contemporary, which is non-teleological in its logic of exposition. Primarily, this is to do with the question of the braiding of times, both in terms of social formation, but in terms of intellectual and cognitive engagements and lineages. In its objectives and its ambition, this targets are framed a larger universe, which may be including a transnational network of the circulation of texts, ideas, which will go back to the 9th century, which also traverses a wide space beyond West Europe, especially between Egypt, India, and the Arabic world. So there's a question of the way ideas of all sorts are circulating, and this is something which the contemporary in this frame continues to be mined, continues to be a kind of resource to think about this time, the way a different order of network can be thought about. This is to unsettle the teleology of modernity, obviously, and the notion of historical periodization. The fact that ancient, medieval, modern, whatever, so that we are now in some space which is continuously modern or post-modern, on the verge of modernity, etc., etc. I take this as an inspiration to think about media, technology, and experience, and I use the cinema as a reference point, partially because of the power and persistence of its significance in the subcontinent, despite many, many technological shifts and changes. But by this notion of the contemporary, I take specifically the question of this question about different levels of media access and technological experience. And the way in which these may actually come together, where transfers may take place from one site to another, but also how culturally differentiated experience will build on this ground. I'm talking about actually variegated populations, which may inhabit the big cities, small townships, but I would reinvent and recirculate, say, notions of language. The net and digital technologies have facilitated the kind of re-emergence of languages which have become marginalized in the epoch of print and the formal practices of constitutional representation. Dialects, smaller marginal forms of linguistic expression, and with it, the revivification of folk forms, and also interesting kinds of interaction between narrative, cinematic narrative, and the way folk forms are reanimated with the cinematic. I won't go into detail there. There's actually a lot on the Sarai website relating to actually contemporary ways in which media experience can be mapped in the relationship between online circulation, file transfer, and the way in which this can be transferred to subaltern populations, working within very distinct circuits of cultural experience. I may refer you to the Sarai website and our social media fellowships as an index of this kind of material. Today, briefly, I'm just going to look much more focusedly on the online, and get back to the relationship between the online and the offline, and pursue this logic of the unexpected. And I'll take you through 2 or 3 photographs. Gina, if you'd kindly just, there are just 3 or 4 photographs at the beginning of this. This relates to the unexpected arrival of a bunch of photographs, which apparently the head of the Life Bureau in New Delhi took in 1951. They were never published as far as I know, although there is a watermark at the bottom there which says Life. This is the first time we've heard about this. And it is, of course, the classic image of what could be a casting couch, a very specific way in which women are being evaluated by men, and a very powerful and significant male director whose career straddles some 40 years, from the silent epoch through to the 1960s. So we have here, unexpectedly, and the arrival on the net just a couple of years ago, I believe, and something like 50 years after the passing of this photographer who died in a photo shoot in the Himalayas in 1964. So we don't even know who is actually going to look for. Perhaps we will one of these days. But it is the unexpected emergence of such images which actually put a certain frame, if you want, about how we understand the cinema. We always perhaps suspected it to be this. And it's a kind of public secret that the ways in which women are actually kind of drawn in and actually exploited and used, or the situation of the cinema. But to actually see it is, of course, a revelation of a particular sort. I want to take you from one side of the spectrum of the unexpected to the other side. Here is something which is, if you want, covered. It's secretive. It's not meant for disclosure, although, of course, it's interesting to think about how this American photojournalist got particular access and could be trusted. But that's probably part of a kind of the subterranean of a diplomatic history of a peculiar sort at the time. But we go to the other extreme of the contemporary, which is the often a much demeaned, much maligned state newsreel and short filmmaking unit, which was set up immediately after independence in 1948. And here we have another online kind of form, whose terms of reference should be predictable, and whose logic for putting this material together should also be predictable, in that it's to do with the documentation of the state, the actual the honoring of the state in its modernizing and developmental enterprises after independence, and its bid to kind of build a communicative communicational network for the citizens of this widely dispersed and differentiated country. In point of fact, it has also been a kind of the source of the unexpected. It is now the unexpected is to do partially with its own low level of archival systematicity. So we're not quite sure still what is available, but bits and pieces are being put up. What is interesting and why it becomes a suggestive space to think about the unexpected and the surprise encounter is an intervention. And the intervention is specifically online intervention by an artist who has coined a humorous blog. It's now over, but it's still available online, called Sarkari Shorts. Sarkar refers to government in Hindi, and Sarkari suggests the type of by-rote, unimaginative, bureaucratic forms of administrative engagement, and the idea that this was yoked to the cinema as an enterprise through the government after 1948. So it's an ironic put down of the actual ambition of governmental enterprise, but its main objective thereafter, and this is undertaken by an artist who actually has a grounding in a certain level of knowledge about Hindi, Sanskrit, classical Indian music and dance, but has a fully wry and of humorous scatological kind of engagement with many of the enterprises of formal government and formal filmmaking. But what he does is to pull out the unexpected, the unusual components of what was made during at various points in time under government ages. Now, again, I can only refer you to this, but there's an experimental wing which emerges under government ages, under the aegis of a maverick UNESCO film administrator who was brought in the late 60s. So this is a second register, if you want, through the register specifically of the curational, where the online becomes a deposit, an archive, but then it also manifests as an unexpected entity through a curatorial intelligence and awareness. So these are just snapshots because I do not want to take either it's too complex a terrain perhaps to take you more fulsomely into it. The other level is the ways in which the state, and this is an argument I'm trying to, that we're actually in a situation where this new digital form, the forms of the deposit, the forms of archiving, the forms of curation, are now coming together with an exceptional kind of adding of material on a day-to-day basis of all sorts, and often with a view to actually presenting the state and its history as a key reference point and heritage, at a time when in fact the state is being substantially dismantled. Many of the kind of social welfare dimensions of the state, which had defined a lot of post-independence policy-making and planning apparatuses, now are under pressure for revision. So it's a peculiar moment that the state itself, in this avatar and in this particular way, images and sounds of it are actually being relayed by itself, is no longer quite there. So there's a peculiar kind of uncanniness with which it's coming into being. But not only is it not there, but the very people who composed it and who were in a peculiar sense repressed or not able to speak through it. For example, people who used to work for state broadcasting and the All India Radio, which had a monolithic and a monopolistic relationship to broadcasting, worked as functionaries, but now are in a position to come out with all sorts of materials which the state archive had refused to give people. So there's a peculiar way where the disassembling of the state takes place to reveal or to disclose the complex constituents and the different types of point of view which actually resided within it. One key issue was when in the 1950s, film music was entirely banned from All India Radio because it was considered a hybrid form which undermined the classicism which national art forms should aspire to in the wake of decolonization. But many of the practitioners who actually were part of film broadcasting and broadcasting under state aegis are now coming out with all sorts of materials from the archives about programming, about various print publications, and about radio biographies of people who are involved. And here, radio and cinema are very close. There's an intermediality involved here, which is quite critical to the South Asian context. And you have a number of such instances, and you have excellent research, mainly through the register of the collector. It's the third, another field. Beyond the archive, the deposit, the online deposit, the physical archive undertaken by the government, we have a proliferation of collectors who have long histories moving through print, but now moving into the world of online archiving, database organization, and the creation of search engines, often on the basis simply for a certain cinephiliac, community-based engagement. And films which had been lost, which probably were lost certainly as celluloid, but still had a life as VHS or video compact disc, suddenly start getting uploaded on all sorts of sites. So another strata of the unexpected emerges in the idea of lost films, and not marginalia, not documentaries, not newsreels, but actually mainline entertainment cinema which have been lost, being retrieved and uploaded. So we have, through these a myriad uploads, we have the kind of new configurations of material which are about the cinema, which have been lost to the cinema, but which are now part of this contemporary time. There is a logic of preservation, not simply of the materiality of forms, but the possibility of access, which animates this context. Insofar as a lot of new material and new types of cinematic knowledge are coming up, without clear attribution from all sorts of sources, there's an anxiety on the part of cinema research, of historians, how to ensure that this is not going to get dissipated. We have here, it's an online resource, it's a major enterprise involving many film scholars called indiancine.ma, which you can check out. But one of the keys to the whole enterprise was to use a clause within the Indian Copyright Act that any material which was older than 60 years would automatically fall out of copyright. Vinzenz Heidegger has put together this rather interesting argument that any of these contexts where preservation is an issue, the other side of preservation would be a logic of revenue mining. How, so where commerce comes in, corporate firms come in, to ensure that an archive can be preserved, can be generated, but with a view to kind of mining it on the grounds of the new media formats which would emerge, whether this is television after the Second World War, video, VHS, and more contemporary digital DVD formats now. But there's this interface. Heidegger has this argument that, in fact, the archive is still crucial, or the archivist or scholarly intelligence is still quite crucial to this, in order to kind of sustain it as an archival form. But there will be this complex interplay. And indeed, the 60-year rule is being quickly mined by a lot of people to upload, preserve, and in the face of massive efforts by Indian video companies to appropriate this, to generate new rights around this material for which the rights no longer exist, with one specific kind of context, which is 24-hour television in India, which is a kind of ready-made client for filling time, literally getting content of any sort and filling it, so that the revenues arising from video availability become another resource which corporate firms are trying to mine, and which enterprises such as indiancine.ma are swiftly trying to access, upload, preserve, and put online for public use. It's a very complex form involving annotation of all sorts, and it's been a remarkable mobilizer of cinema history in the contemporary. There are a lot of streams of engagement between the online and the offline, which I gestured to at the beginning. I will not go into now. As I said, if you would like to pursue this, we can talk about it a bit in the discussion. It's also available, you get intimations of it on the current Sarai website, where a number of people have been working on this thing between material, this transfer of material between the online into portable, cheap media, and even telephony, mobile telephony. Relates to a particular configuration of what I call the offline or the online, in terms of a certain register of spectacle, which I still think has something to do with the cinema. It doesn't immediately seem, it probably would not seem to be so when you look at this. But for those of you who are reasonably acquainted with world affairs, they would recognize on this mobile lorry the current Indian Prime Minister's face, and that is Narendra Modi. And in 2012, for the first time, there's a particular assemblage which was put together. It's to do, in a sense, with the online, specifically YouTube, and the offline, in terms of a performativity of politics, or making politics present, in which the cinema stage becomes the context for a hologram, the release of a three-dimensional image, which the conceit is taking place in a myriad locations at the same time, and is being beamed at the very moment that the speech and the self-presentation is being made in a studio up in Delhi or in Bombay. So this is the actual apparatus of presentation. This is a remarkable moment, because what we have is the coming together, I think, into of a logic of this production of spectacle, of political spectacle, but in the name of proximity and of presence. It is not ground, it is predicated on remoteness of address, and therefore abides by the logic of television and the making present or liveness of television. But as we will see just now, there's an interesting disjunction in time. Now, what I want so the conceit is that you have a number of different electoral constituencies and localities, the appearance of all these lorries with these gossamer thin screens on which a projection will take place, and the appearance of a three-dimensional entity will emerge, who will be close to you, who the audience can get close to. Contemporary Bollywood filmmaking was mobilized for this. A figure called Mani Shankar, who had actually used special effects considerably in the last few years, was part of the whole hologram thing. It comes from the company Musion, who were involved in the Tupac Shakur performance, where the demised singer actually appears on stage, and so it's modeled on that format. And Musion is the company which does both of these. Now, the interesting disjunction, which I start coming to a conclusion here, is the fact that there is this conceit of presence. The presence becomes the kind of logic that I am present to you. It is separate content. It is not necessarily to do with the content which someone sitting in a village in Gujarat. So I just am taking an extract from a 58-minute. Okay. Now I just want to tell you about it. Now the whole logic of this particular thing is that you have a presentation which is taking place in a studio, which is meant to be being beamed simultaneously to all these kind of places as hologram, right? Now, when you look at it, it's a recording. And what is interesting about the recording is the fact that it is taking place in the studio with an autonomous kind of soundtrack, which is made as a presentation for a YouTube audience. Now, this is a distinction. It's not for an audience in the world, in a physical location at an electoral meeting, but it's quite clearly both things. It's meant to be for a YouTube audience, and for a physical audience in a particular locality. Now, the irony of the situation is that when Modi enters, it's as if there is someone in front of him, and he has to lay claim at the point which I've identified, that he can see everyone in front of him on the screen. That is, everyone who is out there amongst the electorate. He can see, and he's asking them to raise all their arms at the hands at the same time and to actually say, long live Mother India. And the irony is that the YouTube only allows silence because it has to be filled by an audience which is not there. If you play it now, you'll get an idea of this phenomenon.
मेरे साथ पूरी ताकत से दोनों हाथ ऊपर करके आपको भारत माता की जय बोलनी है। दोनों हाथ ऊपर करके सबको मैं सुनना चाहता हूं और मैं यहां से देखना चाहता हूं। मेरे सामने स्क्रीन पर हिंदुस्तान के सभी कोने के कार्यक्रम मैं देख रहा हूं और इसलिए मैं आपसे एक साथ देश में भारत मां की जय बुलाना चाहता हूं। भारत माता की